Wait, JL. Welcome to session 4 of the Race and Identity Dialogue series. And we are glad you're here to talk with us and listen to a discussion on letters on Blackness, exploring African American literature. Today's presenters are our very own Landers, Dr. James Anderson. He's the Associate Professor of English and English Education. We also have a guest with us here who is not from the Lander community, but we are glad you are here, Dr. Wallace Baxter III, Adjunct Assistant Professor of English at Gettysburg College in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Welcome to our presenters today. We're glad. You all want to take a moment and say something, and then we will begin our dialogue.
Well, thank you for having us, Reverend Carter Thomas. This is a real thrill, and it's been a great process. And I want to thank the folks that are here with us online today. I see a few names, and I want to be sure to thank some of them at the end for everything they've done. But it's great to be here.
Yeah, I agree. I echo those sentiments. It's great to be here, and I am grateful for the opportunity and the invitation to share with you all, and excited about this series, really, having learned about it. And I think it's something great for the Lander community.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson and Dr. Baxter. We're glad you're here. And to our participants, please engage with our presenters during the recording today. They will be answering questions, responding to your comments and reflections through the chat. And also you can use the Ask Question feature at the bottom of the screen there. If you have a specific question for our presenters, they'd be happy to engage with you. This is a shortened dialogue. Usually our dialogues go an hour and a half. This one is 1 hour. And so we will not have time at the end for follow-up discussions. So please make use of the chat feature while we're all watching this presentation that I thoroughly enjoyed having with them on Baldwin and Coates. And so please enjoy this. Feel free to talk back and share. And then I will be back at the end to remind you to take our survey and join us for our next dialogue. And now we present to you the conversation. Welcome to session 4 of the Race and Identity Dialogue series at Lander University. Today's session is titled Letters on Blackness, Exploring African American Literature. We have co-presenters with us today, Lander University's own Dr. James Anderson, Associate Professor of English and English Education. And we also have a guest, Dr. Wallace C. Baxter III, Adjunct Assistant Professor of English at Gettysburg College in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Welcome, both of you, to Race and Identity Dialogue series.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Glad to be here.
So we have a insightful and wonderful conversation planned for today. And I'd like to begin with Dr. Anderson telling us, out of all the pieces you could have chose out of the vast library of African American literature, the pieces that you chose today that we're going to focus on, why did you choose those pieces?
Thank you for that question. That's the exact question I ask my student teachers, the future high school teachers that I teach. Of everything you can teach, why teach that? So I guess I would start a little bit with my personal journey with African American literature. It is not my specialty. It's not what I focused on in my graduate studies. I do have a background in American literature, but when I came to Lander, my focus was more on literacy, composition, English education. But in my campus interview, I was asked, could you teach African American literature? Well, the answer is always yes to that question, but I really meant it. And when I came to Lander and began working with the student body, I saw that course wasn't being taught. and that someone needed to teach it. So I did a deep dive, as we all do when we're trying to learn something. Teaching is learning, and it's been a very enriching experience. And James Baldwin really caught my eye several years ago when I was planning, almost too much so, where I wanted to do too much James Baldwin. Maybe I'll do a class in James Baldwin one day, but especially his essays, I tend to put more nonfiction in that class than maybe my students would like. You know, we all love stories, but there's just something about the language and the immediacy and the honestness, the honesty in his work. So the Fire Next Time, the volume, the slim little volume that My Dungeon Shook comes from, was something that really appealed to me. And it's because of Baldwin and, of course, the popularity of Ta-Nehisi Coates's Between the World and Me that I came to that text fairly recently. I didn't read it really till last summer. So those are parts of the reasons that I chose these texts, and I thought that it would offer a really interesting space for discussion. So many themes that I'm sure will come up today. The role of American idealism, masculinity, multiple generations speaking to one another. I teach my students, be careful when you use second person when you're speaking to you, but there's something so immediate and beautiful about these two writers being able to speak to someone they love and use that you that I think really can appeal to lots of different readers. So those are just a few of the reasons that I chose these texts.
Thank you. Before we dive in and talk specifics around the text, I wanted Dr. Baxter to open with talking about race as a social construct. As I was reflecting on this work of race and identity dialogue and being in our second semester, I came to this work with the idea that race as a social construct, that was the premise of the conversation, that was foundational. And I neglected to acknowledge that many are not there or have not had those conversations about what that means, have not had that unpacked. And often because we do not speak about it in everyday conversation or even in teaching in classrooms in our nation as a whole. And so I've realized that part of the struggle of discussing race and identity in this dialogue and even outside of here is that many hold the notion as race is biological, and also that the systemic problems that we face in this nation could be remedied if we just do better at accepting difference or encouraging diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I want to begin, before we dive into Baldwin and Coates' work, of just putting that out there. Dr. Baxter, tell us a little bit about how that, speak to that. You don't have to, we could spend a whole session on that, but speak to that and maybe move us forward into discussing the work of how that may be critical to helping us understand this work. And even, can we really understand African-American literature unless we believe that race is a social construct?
Right. Yes. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm grateful for the opportunity to share and to have this conversation with James. I'm excited about it. Yes, that is right on target. This idea or concept of race being a social construct. There's a lot of buzz in the political arena right now, and you've heard CRT, critical race theory, thrown around like time and time again during the election season. And it's interesting that critical race theory in particular has existed for 30 years nearly, and we're just really seeing it hit mainstream. It's been kind of in an academic silo of sorts for some time. But it's interesting because one of the tenets of critical race theory is that race is a social construct, that it's not just kind of this Darwinism type biological reality in and of itself, that biologically we are very much the same, but socially, economically, it's different. That's where the difference comes in. And so this idea of race being a social construct is literally this idea that I like to kind of frame it in the terms of American exceptionalism or divine right, notions of divine right, where because I am white, then I possess the power, I possess the purse, and I then can name and frame people in whatever context I want to frame them in. And so there's this picture, this image by this painter, rather, from years ago, named Van der Stray. And in this portrait, there's this depiction of clearly a white conqueror of some sort standing with a staff. At the top of the staff is the cross, and beneath that is their country's flag, and there are native people in front of them, and it seems like some kind of exchange is going on. And really, the name of the painting is America, and so it really is kind of like this depiction of the founding of America, right? And basically, this idea of divine right or American exceptionalism really comes from that reality that I can conquer this space and these people. And by doing so, anybody that comes after I've taken up residence and position, they are beneath me as well. And so they're in order to remain in power, in order to remain in position, you have to label people. You have to other people. Like, that's the only way you can maintain your position. And so it's been kind of this journey throughout the American landscape where minorities, and in particular Black people, have been racialized in a unique way. And Coates really articulates that in a unique way, in that he deals with whiteness and Blackness differently in his letter. Like, he deals with whiteness kind of as just a reality, but deals with Blackness as more of an existential reality. Like, whiteness is just kind of it's an ideal, so to speak, but Blackness is actually like, you're in it and there's nothing you can really do seemingly to get out of it. And of course, I too see the connection between Coates and then Baldwin with My Dungeon Shook, who of course at the time he writes it, it's like we've never seen anything like this before, you know. Now it's more kind of commonplace, but with Baldwin's piece, it was definitely trend setting. And I think it's something I like you, when I teach this kind of, like, particularly like the Harlem Renaissance and even going into the Black arts movement, things like that with Baldwin, I often do like the critical essays and things. And it's not as fun, but it really gets you behind the scenes and underneath those surface layers of literature, you know, which I appreciate as well. So we're definitely on the same page.
Great. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah.
That leads us into the next question. So one of the motifs we see in Baldwin's work, and this one and others, and the thrust has to do with the lies we tell, and specifically going back to qualifying those pronouns, the country, the democracy, the lies that this country tells people. And in his speech in 1963, the year that this also was written, in his speech at Howard University, Baldwin declared, "We must tell the truth till we can no longer bear it." And then in the letter to his nephew, he writes, "The entire narrative of this country argues against the truth of who you are." What do you believe Baldwin's talking about here when he talks about these lies, this motif of lying? What does that mean, and what does that speak to us specifically at that time, maybe, but also thinking about today? What is he speaking to?
Well, I think part of it goes back to what Dr. Baxter set up so beautifully with the constructs that we are just now, especially when it comes to race, beginning to accept. And I say, again, we, mainstream America, I would say, is just now paying attention to it, or at least outwardly paying attention to it. I may clarify what I mean there in a minute, but I think what Baldwin really is able to get at is, those lies are institutional. I mean, those lies are, for him and other African-American writers, part of the establishment of America. And those are very difficult things for some people to hear and listen to. But it's through the voice of his work and the clarity of his work that he gets to some of these issues of the social construct, and America being really built on those. That America is built on those lies. That America is built on racism, and so it's certainly no coincidence that he's writing this letter on the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation, which we know did not end slavery, was a rhetorical move, and it's beyond probably this discussion for how effective it was, but certainly was not any sort of definitive legal document. And I think that at that point, 100 years later, he's still trying to illuminate that reality, and really setting the stage for future work, for someone like Coates to build upon.
Well said, Dr. Anderson. Dr. Baxter?
Yeah, I would agree, and I'd also point out that one of the interesting things about kind of how Baldwin negotiates this idea of race, and Coates does something very similar, is that Baldwin never loses sight of the I, right? Never loses sight of the personhood of Black people, where it's almost as though he's hearkening back to the slave narratives of old, the emancipatory narratives of old, where the first line of most of those narratives is "I was born," right? And so he's literally reminding his nephew, look, you are a person, you're a human being, don't ever forget that. And time again he comes back to that and talking about America basically being structured or set up to thwart your being from succeeding, whatever that looks like, right? And because I remember he even says in one point when he's reflecting on his father, his nephew's grandfather, where he says that he was basically defeated long before he ever died, because he really believed what white people said about him. He believed the narrative that had been constructed about him. Here you are growing up trying to succeed, yet people are constantly telling you who you are, but they aren't really telling you who you can be, right? And who you really are. And so it's this conundrum that you're caught in.
Yeah, that's so true. He says in one part, you were born into a society which spelled out with brutal clarity and is and in as many ways as possible that you were a worthless human being. You were not expected to aspire to excellence. You were expected to make peace with mediocrity. And then he goes on to speak and say, remember you and your past, where you are and where you come from, to sort of work against that narrative. And that must be a very difficult place for him and his nephew to experience, where if you speak out against the American narrative, where you're essentially saying you're essentially speaking out against America, and therefore may be represented as un-American. So it is a very complex nexus of narratives that are certainly not just competing, but obscuring the view. And Dr. Baxter, when you brought up the connections and sort of the lineage of the I am narrative of stating, well, I was born, this is my earliest recollection. It makes me think of W.E.B. Du Bois in The Souls of Black Folk, and how he remembers his I am moment, essentially showing him that he's a, quote, problem for America. His Blackness is a problem for America. And that narrative we see lasting all the way through until 1962, when Baldwin is writing this letter to his nephew.
Agreed. I even, just when you mentioned Du Bois, I even think about The Invisible Man, Ralph Ellison, and how at the end of that, the very last line, I'll never forget it. It's, who knows, perhaps on the lower frequencies, I speak for you, right? It's this idea that on the lower frequencies of life, when you're the problem, when you are always being positioned as the least, the last, the left out, what have you, there are those like a Baldwin, like a Du Bois, like other protagonists in stories, kind of like the Invisible Man, that will speak for you and will encourage you, kind of in a sense, to keep on fighting, which I believe both Coates and Baldwin are doing. Is their main purpose is to kind of encourage, in Coates' case, his son, in Baldwin's case, his nephew, to hang in there, to keep fighting, but know what you're fighting against and know why you're fighting too.
Would you say, Dr. Baxter, that the fight that Baldwin speaks to his nephew about is the same or similar to what Coates is speaking to his son about, thinking of the different time periods? Does the fight change?
I think that the fight is very similar. I kind of would say that the fight is the same as far as the basically the social empire that you're fighting against, right? But I think that it's on steroids now, and so it's so multivalent at this juncture that I don't even know if Baldwin would have necessarily foreseen how involved it has become, because with the, with social media now, and with all of the technology and all of the other way, and how travel has advanced even from Baldwin's time to now, like all of these things, of course, not a lot of travel right now, but how the world has gotten smaller, right? The world has gotten smaller, so much so that when Baldwin was alive, he could go to France to escape America. You can't necessarily do that now. It's amazing how things have kind of changed so much. And so I think the fight is still the same, that we're fighting against this idea of what it means to be white in America and what it means over against what it means to be Black in America. But it's so different. It's just on steroids now. It's just different. But it's definitely the if you were to pinpoint the enemy is the same.
I agree. I agree, and in fact, I think it's telling. I love to think of what James Baldwin would say about America today, but looking at what he did say, I mean, he talks about race in innocent America. He uses that quote, "innocent America," and certainly we know that he's doing that intentionally, and there could be multiple meanings. It could be sarcastic. It could speak to, well, America's innocent because America doesn't get it. It could be just he could be pulling from his early traditions in the church. Forgive those who sin against me. But I agree with you 100%, Dr. Baxter, that yes, the message is very similar, and in fact, on purpose at times. Yet the game has changed, and the context has changed, and the social constructs are still there, but like you say, are now on steroids, and fed by a wider range of media, perspectives, but still, I agree. I think that Baldwin would be very surprised. I could see him sitting back in his little chair and and just soaking it all in.
As we think about the fight and the lies that have been exacerbated and are on steroids in a new way in this decade, they've intensified from the 60s. Obviously, there was intensity and different battles in the 60s. But when we think about today's evils and how they've evolved, how do the works of Baldwin and Coates relate to current discussions on policing, protest, and race relations?
I think that both of these works do definitely tie into our current realities with police brutality, policing, protest, all of these things. And as a matter of fact, both writers have some how do I say this, some righteous protest written into their letters. They have this righteous protest to basically kind of say, don't just lie down. Don't just let the system overtake you. I'm sharing this information with you so that you can see it coming. And when it comes, you'll be prepared to handle it, to take it on. And so with that, that is kind of like the protest tradition, really, of African-American literature, if you will. And it's one of these things where they bring up, of course, Coates begins his talking about, you've witnessed these murders, you've witnessed Black people killed by police, and so it's there in your face up front. And so in reality today, that has become the uniform that whiteness wears. In a sense, the police uniform has become the uniform that whiteness wears. And so it's interesting that we talk about community policing and all of these things where, you almost have to start from scratch to get back to getting to know the community so that you can build that trust in order for police in many of our Black communities to be seen as those who protect and serve, right? Regardless of who they are, regardless of them as an individual, it then kind of just sucked up into this collective identity, right? And so it has definitely strained race relations in a major way. And I think a lot of what we've seen, particularly recently, is kind of the outgrowth of years and decades of not having these conversations, right? I think that's the crux of it. And I think that's how it relates to what we're doing right now.
I think if you only read this piece by Baldwin, I don't know that you get a full sense of his outrage. And I think part of that is because of his, one of his primary audience, at least on the page, of being his nephew. If you watch any of luckily we have many videos of him in interviews. And in one particular interview, he was asked by a radio host about Black America, and he said, and I'm paraphrasing some of it, but he said to be Black in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be in a state of rage almost all of the time and in one's work. And part of the rage is it is only what is happening to it. It isn't only what is happening to you, but it's what's happening all around you and all the time in the face of the most extraordinary and criminal indifference. A complex thing can't be made simple, he says. And so I have no doubt that that Baldwin would be very supportive of things that are happening now in our society, including Black Lives Matter, its focus on inclusion. Certainly that would be something that I think he would support. It's tricky with Coates, and I don't know that I have a great answer for Coates, but certainly, as Dr. Baxter pointed out earlier, his treatment of Black and white society, or people, if you will, in the context of what he calls the American dream, it is a bit more sticky. And he says things like, at one point he said something like, I decided that just the American trophy case wasn't enough, and I think I know he's talking about the sense of American meritocracy and idealism. I could read into that as well, and I kind of get the sense that he also implies that some of the strides that America has made in terms of race would be on that trophy case, and he's not going to simply just look at the trophy case and say, okay, great, we're doing great. I don't know. I'm sure he's spoken about current movements and this resistance, and certainly his work is a major influence in that area. But I also think Baldwin, even though he was judging America from afar at times, was clearly very American and very on board with movements of transgression and resistance.
Yeah, I moved at reading this at a different point in my life. And so I'm curious, what speaks to you? What is that part of either Baldwin or Coates, or maybe a theme that we see in both of their pieces, that speaks to you on a personal level, or that makes you wrestle in a way that maybe you hadn't before? I'm curious about that. Dr. Anderson?
I think I read this time very similarly to you, and that I really got a sense of acceptance and love as a father myself, who's also the same age as Coates and Tiger Woods. So that doesn't make you feel unaccomplished at all. As a father of a 12-year-old, so much is there. But yes, that you are loved and that you must love them, that you must accept them. You must accept them and accept them with love. And that repetition of that really did strike me. And that's what I meant earlier. If one were to read this piece alone, you wouldn't get a clear sense of how dogmatic at times Baldwin could be, and fierce. But there's in that, I think there's a definite strength there, and in some ways I feel like he's almost writing that in spite of some of his feelings in order to convey that love. And that's a heavy act, I think. An act of kindness, not only for forgiveness, but also to pass along to future generations.
Yeah, I agree. And similarly, as a father, and not quite the same age as Tiger and Coates and Dr. Anderson, I've learned. No, but as a father, I too feel the burden, right, of ensuring that my son, feels the same kind of love from me, basically. But there's something significant that Baldwin says towards the end of his letter, where he says very simply, "You don't be afraid. I said that it was intended that you should perish in the ghetto, perish by never being allowed to go behind the white man's definitions, by never being allowed to spell your proper name. You have, and many of us have, defeated this intention." He says, you have, and many of us have defeated this intention. And so one of the things that I strive to do, and will continue to strive to do, is make sure that my son encounters people who have defeated this intention, who see it, who understand it, who haven't defeated it in a way that is, violent or what have you, but in a similar way that Baldwin suggests, right? And he has a lot of more radical kind of claims and things, which we know. But he says, and if the word integration means anything, this is what it means: that we, with love, shall force our brothers to see themselves as they are, to cease fleeing from reality and begin to change it. For this is your home, my friend. Do not be driven from it. Great men have done great things here and will again. And we can make America what America must become, right? It kind of goes back to what Langston Hughes said in his poem, Let America Be America, right? And so it's this idea that there's an opportunity, right? And I have to be a part of making sure that the potential of America is reached, and I have to make sure that my son is also committed to making sure that the potential of America is reached. I remember it was Gandhi, I believe, who was asked a question about what are your thoughts on American democracy, and he said, "I think it's a great idea." And it's this thing that if you read America on paper, it's very progressive, hopeful, and idealistic, right? But if you get your boots on the ground, then you begin to see the opportunities that exist to hopefully change the narrative and reach those ideals of the American dream, right? Yeah.
And to build to follow up on that, and this is something I should have stated earlier. I mean, obviously, when I read this as a father, I and privileged enough to read it differently than other people read this. But as a part of that, and I love what you said, that, you know, America on paper, right? That's the, you know, we are exceptional in many, many, many ways that are quantifiable. But we're all, what I love about these texts is that they challenge me, and hopefully whomever I can get to read it, to read America on paper, and to read it on this paper on which they're writing, and to, despite my best efforts, you know, check any sort of misconceptions or bias or privilege or you know, and which is very difficult for some people to do that. But it's because of these voices that, you know, it confirms some things that we feel, you know, many of us, I think, feel in society, that the narrative is not as clearly written in stone as we might think it is.
I was struck with what Dr. Baxter highlighted from Baldwin's work about integration, and both of you talking about being fathers. I wanted to kind of press into what Baldwin says around integration, but also asked Dr. Baxter perhaps respond from a personal level and how this speaks to you when he says on page 8 of the handout that we have that will be posted on the website, there is no reason for you to try to become like white people, and there is no basis whatever for their impertinent assumption that they must accept you. The really terrible thing, old buddy, is that you must accept them.
Yeah.
What do you do with that, Dr. Baxter, and how?
Yeah. There it's one of these things, right, that I look at it or read it, and we talk about, you know, the way we read text, right? We bring our different approach to a text, or a different hermeneutic or whatever lens to a text, and in this, in reading that, it's one of those things where accepting, I read it more as accepting them in that moment where they are, because you can't accept them any other kind of way, because if you can't push yourself to at least accept them in that moment, then you can never even get to the hard conversations that push them beyond where they are. And I think if real change is going to happen, if real transformation is going to happen, it's going to start with that mutual kind of understanding of acceptance at the outset. But I don't think it's a just perpetual acceptance that, like, no, I accept you and you can just stay this way forever. Nope. We got to change at some point. And so this acceptance is, it's almost like a conditional acceptance, at least the way that I read it, where I'm going to accept you for the sake of doing this work. And when that happens, the hope is that they will learn to accept you as well. Basically, if we had a moral barometer or whatever, Baldwin is basically saying, you take the moral high road. You take the moral high road, and they will grow to get to that point where they accept you for who you are.
Thank you for sharing that. What a dynamic reading of that. I have never thought about it in that way. That's helpful. Yeah, it's helpful to think about it that way. As we close, Dr. Anderson, around being an educator, being a father, one of the things I was struck by in the excerpts that you shared from Coates's work is his discussion of personal responsibility. And I think in this academic space, and those who are engaging, joining us during this live session, To think about personal responsibility, I'd like to end on some words of wisdom. I'm going to read this excerpt from Coates's work on page 33. But a great number of educators spoke of personal responsibility in a country authored and sustained by a criminal responsibility. The point of the language of intention and personal responsibility is broad exoneration. Mistakes were made, bodies were broken, people were enslaved. We meant well. We tried our best. Good intention is a whole pass through history, a sleeping pill that ensures the dream.
Well, again, I think that it comes back very nicely to Dr. Baxter's discussion of the social construct of race and America, and the dream really sort of representing not just the American dream, but a specific American dream of white America and mainstream America, which again sounds amazing on paper. However, it is also very much dictated by the social construct. Going back to what Baldwin said to his nephew, I mean, for so long, Black people have been a fixed star to Americans, something that just can be pointed to and isolated and contained within a rhetorical, social, legal, physical construct. And I think that part of the responsibility speaks to where you are, who you are. If you are questioning the dream at all, if you can see those constructs, then good intentions aren't good enough, in the sense that it's the responsibility to work not just within, but perhaps against some of those constructs, to continue to acknowledge their existence in a way that in a way that's very difficult for some people. I remember mentioning to a student in another class that I was teaching a class on African American literature, a young white man, and he very nicely and I think very earnestly asked, well, what is that? And I got a sense that he meant, why is that? Why is that a thing? And I think that part of it is that reading these types of works and hearing these voices puts personal responsibility on us, that says you as reader are now responsible for having heard this. So those are some of the things that I get from that amazing passage.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Dr. Baxter?
Yeah, I agree that that's the joy of education, of being an educator, right? Is that if you take it, I always say, if you take it seriously enough, then you want to bring some sense of discomfort to the classroom. You want to bring some sense of reverence to certain topics, certain discussions, and sometimes some sense of just indignation towards certain things, because that's the fertile ground of progress, right? Nothing grows out of just stagnancy. It grows out of some turnover and some disruption. That's how things grow, right? And so I think the personal responsibility is there. Like when you're teaching your students, and you see, I think it was Phyllis Wheatley in her poem to the students at the University of Cambridge that said, called them ye blooming plants, right? It's this idea that they're right there and you can see the potential, and your job is simply to give them as many tools as possible to go out there, be great, change things for the better, so that then their kids can also grow up in a world that's better than it was when they came through. So yeah.
So really to build on what Dr. Baxter was saying, as an educator, I agree that the classroom should be a space of transgression at times. That the status quo, even in a pedagogical sense, is in the past. It's done. We've done that. When it comes to bigger issues like the works and discussions that we've been having, I think it's even more important. We need look no further. Really, just go back to what Dr. Baxter was saying from the beginning, how critical race theory has been around for a while, but a lot of people probably know about it right now because of the reactions that have been sent that way in terms of what that means for education. And it's become very, while already a political thing and for good reason, has been politicized to sort of put a dark light on it. But to me, and I agree with Dr. Baxter, that means that there's something there, that there's a reason to use it, to work through it, to use some of its components, to question the narratives that these authors are digging into, and in that way, you can actually question the status quo and maybe even be aware of it a little bit better.
Yeah, I agree. It's our job, it's our calling, even as educators, to ensure that. And I certainly would just say to all of the students, that to take risks. And what I mean when I say take risks is if there's something that you feel is just overlooked in the classroom or not being addressed or what have you, take the risk to send your professor an email. Because oftentimes when it comes to us putting syllabi together and all this stuff, there is so much to choose from, so much material that we kind of pick and choose based on a narrative we're trying to construct throughout the semester. But I, for one, am always open to, I play saxophone, so I'm always open to improvisation, right? And so, and most professors are, if you just reach out, take that risk, reach out. In addition, take the risk to dig deep. Don't just read the chapters that are assigned. Go deeper. Read the entire work if you can. And if not during the semester, afterwards, go back, pick it up, read it again. You'd be surprised at the number of professors that are open to critically engaging text beyond the classroom if you just show your interest in the subject matter. So, whatever it is, and it doesn't have to be in the humanities, it can be in the sciences, whatever it is, just take the risk of digging deep and of reaching out when you want to see something, because the classroom is what you make it.
Well said. Good words. The classroom is what you make it. And so we hope that you will dive deeper into these works, not just Baldwin's essay, but the larger book that Dr. Anderson held up at the beginning, The Fire Next Time, and into Coates' work, Between the World and Me. Both are rich and layered, and we could do a whole series. I mean, we really could meet 10 times and keep going. keep discussing them. There's so many themes and richness around African American literature and these particular men's stories and the way that they speak to beloved young men in their lives. And so we hope that you will pick these up if you haven't read them yet. Thank you for joining us for session 4 of the Race and Identity Dialogue Series, Letters on Blackness, African American Voices in Literature. Thank you. Thank you to session 4's presenters, Dr. Baxter and Dr. Anderson. We have a few minutes before we completely close out. And I just want to give a minute each for each of you to give final comments, reflections, and to our participants. There was some great and dynamic content there, and a lot and heavy content. If you haven't read these pieces that were spoken about today, please go to the RID website through Lander and check out these pieces. They are posted in PDF of excerpts, or read the books for summer reading, assign them. Great discussions and rich information, and also, great questions and comments here in the chat. So let's begin with Dr. Baxter, and then we'll move straight to Dr. Anderson for final comments.
Yeah, I'll just say once again, I'm grateful for the dialogue and how rich the dialogue has been. And I'll just say kind of that, it's so important to have these conversations. And based on some of what we've seen in the chat, it's one of those things, as I see Dr. Carolyn has said, racism grows pretty well from a stagnant mind. That is so true. That a mind that is unwilling to grow, unwilling to expand, unwilling to engage difference and other things, then it's going to fall into the rut of just playing the same song. And we don't want to play the same old song. We want to actually be improvisational thinkers, improvisational students, improvisational teachers that can adapt to the real issues of the day. And so that's kind of what I would want to leave us with, definitely.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson.
And I just want to thank you both, first of all, for having this conversation. I definitely think it's one of the conversations I've enjoyed most in a while that's had anything to do with my work. And I want to thank everyone that was online today and contributed. And I tried to respond to a few questions. I thought they were wonderful. And in a short amount of time, things can get lost in translation, but I'd be more than willing to add or clarify anything that others have a question about. I also posted a link, and now I have not verified this link. I did a quick search of where it comes from and its message, but even if it doesn't suit our purposes well, it might be a starting point, because I think that question about the talk is such a relevant, true, practical thing, and it's something I'm curious about. I don't know the literature about what other families say. Luckily, we have works like we've been able to discuss, so we have some input there. But I think that's something that is definitely worth future study for any of us that are interested about these things. And thanks to Dr. Charnette Parker for the work that she's done in putting that video together. She didn't change my face like I asked, but other than that, I thought it was amazing.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Anderson and Dr. Baxter. Thank you to all who joined us for this conversation. That is our timer to say we are at time. Please take the survey. It's helpful for Dr. Parker, my co-facilitator for the Race and Identity Dialogue, and future, people who will be a part of this conversation. We give a thanks to South Carolina Humanities for funding this initiative, and we are grateful to each of you for joining us this evening. We hope that you join us for session 5 of the Race and Identity Dialogue. Voices of African American Poetry that will take place here in Crowdcast on this Thursday, the 11th at 5:30 p.m. Please join us, and thank you for joining us this evening. Have a wonderful evening.